In a lawless land, where justice was lost and chaos reigned, a dark tale of betrayal, violence, and consequences would emerge to shake a nation. A man in search of reconciliation, a woman who fled oppression, only to be cast into darkness, and a city, Gibeah, that will bear the weight of a crime so terrible that no nation can forget. Prepare for a tale of horror, betrayal, and bloody consequences. When a nation turns a blind eye to evil, the price will be paid in blood. This is the story of Judges 19, a cry for justice that echoes through the ages. The period described in Judges 19 occurs during a time of great disorder in Israel. The narrative begins with a significant phrase. In those days there was no king in Israel, Judges 19 verse 1, signaling the lack of centralized leadership and the deterioration of social cohesion. Without a moral or political authority to guide the nation, Israel descended into chaos, with each tribe, city, and individual acting according to what they considered right. This social backdrop provides the perfect backdrop for the unfolding story. Within this context, we are introduced to a Levite who lived in the hill country of Ephraim. Although his name is not mentioned, he becomes a central figure in the narrative. This man had a concubine, a woman of lower social status than a formal wife, who came from the city of Bethlehem in Judah. The relationship between the Levite and his concubine quickly becomes complicated, as the text reveals that she abandoned him and returned to her father's house. The reason for her departure is not explained in detail, only that she was unfaithful or got angry with him, depending on the translation, and left for Bethlehem. For 4 months, she remained in her father's house, with no apparent initiative from the Levite to seek her out. However, he finally decides to go after her, taking with him his servant and 2 donkeys, demonstrating his intention to reconcile with his concubine and take her back. Journey to the father's house. The Levite, after making the decision to reconcile with his concubine, begins the journey to Bethlehem, accompanied by his servant and 2 donkeys. Upon arriving at the woman's father's house, he is received with great hospitality. The father-in-law, upon seeing the Levite, welcomes him warmly, offering him food, drink, and rest. The atmosphere is marked by a tone of reconciliation, where the Levite's prolonged presence in the house seems to indicate an attempt to overcome the previous rupture with his concubine. The days go by, and the Levite's father-in-law demonstrates a hospitality that, at first glance, may seem excessive. He repeatedly insists that the Levites stay longer. There is a constant exchange of offers of food and drink, representing both the culture of hospitality of that time and the father-in-law's attempt to ensure that the relationship between the Levite and his daughter was truly repaired before they left. On each of these days, the Levite prepares to leave, but his father-in-law convinces him to stay 1 more night. However, after 4 days of insistence, the Levite refuses to delay his departure any longer. On the 5th day, after another offering of food and drink, the Levite, his concubine, and the servant decide to leave, despite their father-in-law's final attempts to get them to stay longer. The journey back to Ephraim finally begins, but the significant delay will cause them to seek shelter in a city as night falls. Searching for shelter in Gibeah. After leaving his father-in-law's house, the Levite, his concubine, and the servant set out for Ephraim. The journey continues until late afternoon, and the small party is faced with a crucial decision: where to spend the night. The servant suggests that they head to the city of Gibeah, later known as Jerusalem, where they might find shelter. However, the Levite refuses, arguing that Gibeah was not an Israelite city, since it was still inhabited by the Jebusites, and he would rather not trust his safety to a foreign people. Instead, he decides that they should head to Gibeah, a city belonging to the tribe of Benjamin, trusting that among the Israelites they would find hospitality. Upon arriving in Gibeah, as night fell, the group enters the town square and waits to be invited by a local to spend the night, as was the custom. However, they are ignored by all the inhabitants, a situation that highlights the moral decline and lack of hospitality that Israel was experiencing at that time. The lack of hospitality in an Israelite city is alarming, especially when compared with the generous welcome given by their father-in-law in Bethlehem. Finally, as night falls, an elderly man, who is also not a native of Gibeah but a stranger from Ephraim, finds them in the square and offers them shelter. He is concerned about their safety in the city and insists that they not spend the night out in the open. The man leads them to his house, and the atmosphere begins to feel more relaxed, with food and drink offered to the Levite, his concubine, and the servant. However, danger soon reveals itself within the city of Gibeah, turning the hospitality into a terrible tragedy. Threat of violence. While the Levite, his concubine, the servant, and the host were enjoying the hospitality inside the house, the tranquility of the evening was interrupted by a disturbing scene. Wicked men from Gibeah, described in the text as sons of Belial, surrounded the house and began banging on the door violently. The mob demanded that the Levite be handed over to them, with the clear intention of sexually abusing him. This incident recalls the horrific episode of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the same type of wickedness was manifested against Lot and his visitors. The host, horrified by the demand, leaves his house and tries to calm the mob. He begs them not to commit such evil against his guest, since, in the culture of that time, there was a strong value of protection for those who sheltered under their roof. As an alternative, the elderly man offers his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine to satisfy the mob's brutality, in a desperate attempt to preserve his guest's honor. However, the host's offer also reflects the depth of moral degradation in Israel, where the life of a woman, whether daughter or concubine, was considered a bargaining chip in times of crisis. Despite his attempt, the men of Gibeah remain obstinate in their goal. In a shocking act of apathy and cowardice, the Levite takes his concubine and hands her over to the mob to save himself. She is taken outside the house, where she is brutally raped and abused throughout the night, in an act of extreme savagery that exposes the decadence of a leaderless and lawless society. Violence against the concubine. The Levite's concubine, left to her own devices, spends the night in the hands of the mob. The men of Gibeah brutally abuse her, an act that not only reflects the depravity of the times, but also symbolizes the moral collapse of a nation without justice and leadership. While she suffers outside, the Levite and his host remain inside the house, doing nothing to prevent the woman's terrible fate. The biblical account does not detail the concubine's thoughts or feelings during this ordeal, but the extreme violence to which she was subjected is undeniable. The morning light finally dawns, and the mob disperses, leaving her severely injured and near death. In a final effort to return to the Levite, she makes her way back to the house where she had been delivered, but her strength fails her before she reaches safety. Falling on the doorstep, she stretches out her hands in a last gesture of despair, waiting to be rescued. At dawn, the Levite leaves his house, seemingly without haste or concern, to find his concubine lying lifeless on the ground. His cold words, "Get up, let us go," reveal a profound insensitivity to what has happened. When he realizes that she is dead, he lifts her onto his donkey, showing no signs of grief or remorse, and sets off for his home in Ephraim. The Levite's treatment of his concubine, both before and after her death, is a cruel reflection of how society at that time viewed women as disposable property. This event marks the culmination of a tragedy that will not be forgotten, prompting the Levite to take extreme measures to ensure that the entire nation is made aware of the horror that has been committed. The Levite's action. The Levite, now back at home in the mountains of Ephraim, decides to take an action that will shock all of Israel. Instead of burying his concubine and mourning her death, he chooses a dark path to demand justice. Taking the woman's body, he cuts it into 12 pieces, sending each part to one of the 12 tribes of Israel. This macabre act is done not only to denounce the atrocity committed in Gibeah, but also to mobilize a national response, forcing the tribes of Israel to confront the horrific reality of the moral disorder that has taken over the country. The Levite's choice to divide the body of his concubine and send it throughout Israel was a symbolic, shocking, and unprecedented gesture. In a time when communication between tribes was limited, the visual and emotional impact of this act would be impossible to ignore. Each tribe, upon receiving a part of the body, was called upon to react to the horror. The act served as an indictment against the city of Gibeah and, more broadly, against the tribe of Benjamin, to which Gibeah belonged. It was a call to collective action, a cry that such a crime could not go unpunished. By taking this extreme measure, the Levite transformed the fate of his concubine into a symbol of national alarm, shedding light on the violence and social disintegration that Israel was experiencing and setting the stage for the impending conflict between the tribes. Israel's reaction. The response to the Levites' act was immediate and overwhelming. The 12 tribes of Israel, upon receiving the pieces of the concubine's body, were horrified. The emotional and moral impact was profound, and a sense of outrage swept through the nation. Never before had anything so grotesque and disturbing been witnessed. News of the violence that had occurred in Gibeah spread quickly, and the tribe soon realized that moral disorder had reached a new level. A crime of such magnitude demanded justice. Leaders and representatives from each tribe gathered at Mizpah, a central place for national assemblies, where all agreed that the crime committed against the concubine could not be tolerated. The Levites' gesture had forced them to face the decaying state of the nation. The meeting at Mizpah became a call to unified action. The tribes, united by their shared horror, decided that the city of Gibeah and the tribe of Benjamin should be held accountable. Thus, Israel prepared for war, not only against an external enemy, but against an internal enemy, one of its own tribes. The sense of justice and revenge unified the tribe. The gathering of the tribes of Israel at Mizpah marks the beginning of something inevitable. Justice must be served. The city of Gibeah and the tribe of Benjamin will be held accountable for the heinous crime. The innocent blood spilled cries out for an answer, and Israel braces itself for civil war. The anger of the tribes is roused, and swords are about to be drawn. On the horizon, the future of a nation hangs in the balance. But before the conflict begins, think, what would you do if you were in their shoes? How would you react to such injustice? Se essa historia te dixu reflexiva, deixu seu comentario abaixo e diga o que você acha que deveria ter acontecido. Como a justica deveria ter sido feita? Neo esse esquica de esse inscrever no canal e ativar as notificações para neo perder os próximos capítulos dessa história impressionante. Vamos juntos discutir essas questões e entender as licos que ela nos traz. Escreva sua opinião. Queremos saber o que você tem a dizer.